Okay. Right. We are now going to carry on whether or not the world is listening, which is a kind of nice metaphor for just about everything we're trying to do. So, Bill, I'm sorry I interrupted you. So let me take you back to the importance of having people on the ground. I mean, that's the thing that you were talking about, was that not just dropping something in, but actually being there in partnership, you're dealing with real people.
Right, and being in the community.
Yes.
Because the need to build the trust and the loyalty, the brand, so to speak, is really critical. And it requires support. This first significant purchase for them requires that level of support. So that's one way to, you got to be innovative. You got to be unique to solve this problem. That's one way we try to address it. The other one that you alluded to was partnerships. And we just recently in Cote d'Ivoire, we announced our partnership with EDF. And it's the first of its kind in our sector, at least, where it's a significant operational and financial relationship between a very large energy company and one that you'd be pleased to hear 3 days ago basically said that the grid's never getting to most of these communities. So we need to disavow ourselves of that and think creatively about how to address it. And a more tech-oriented entrepreneurial company such as Off-Grid. So we're really excited about that. It also brings a very significant capital partner to the table, which this industry requires, because the capital needs to build energy access to this number of people is quite significant. So we're really excited about that. Cote d'Ivoire is our first market to do that, and the idea is to expand that across West Africa.
Fantastic, thank you. So, Aaron, we're talking about energy access as a means of, it's an educational resource, it's a health resource, it's an economic resource. You build businesses, you build well-being, you build, scholars, and your economic infrastructure through energy access. So you would imagine that governments are right on board and doing everything they can to make this happen. I mean, how much policy change actually needs to happen before we really can establish energy access?
Sure. Well, I imagine Bill can speak to this quite a bit as well. But, until very recently, and still to this day in many countries, solar panels they are taxed at the point of import as luxury goods. And so in many countries, your solar panel is taxed at 100, 200, 250%, because the tax code hasn't changed for 20 years. And a lot of the appliances that can be used with solar home systems, for instance, like small refrigerators or freezers, they're tariffed at a very high level as well, making these technologies, which actually would take the burden off of the struggling national grid by providing off-grid and much more efficient tools, they are stopped at the gate and made 2-3 times more expensive. And outside of the solar home system space, when you look at microgrids, which are basically, like our utility grid, but on a community scale. So really, starting at the heart of a community and going out to all of the households and businesses, rather than the national grid, which goes, from city to city. These microgrids are called independent power producers, IPPs. And in many countries, it is illegal to have an IPP. So the national utility has a monopoly on the sale of electricity. And ostensibly, as well, if one of Off-Grid Electric's customers were to take a wire and string it from their house to their neighbor's house and sell them electricity, that would be illegal too, because you are selling electricity, and you cannot do that unless you're the utility. And one of the biggest challenges on the policy side in a lot of energy poor countries is really the political power issues of the electrical power industry. That there's a lot of vested interests in kind of keeping things the way that they are. And also on the other side, these technologies are quite new. A lot of things have changed in the past 5 to 7 years. I mean, in the United States, for instance, the price of solar has dropped over 80% in the last 7 years. And in a lot of energy poor countries, this is just not clear to a lot of utilities how to deal with these changes. And so there's a lot of political change, but there's just a lot of education that's also needed on the side of regulators, on the side of utilities and ministries. And if you go to the delegations that are negotiating the action process to the Paris Accord right now, they're all from understaffed and kind of under capitalized ministries as well. But then you go into the actual implementation side, and again, they're just undercapacitated, and we need a really big push on that front as well. And this is even so in the African context. This is even on the donor side. So the U.S. government and the U.K. government both have big flagship energy programs. One is called Power Africa from the U.S. side, and one is called Energy Africa from the U.K. side. And it's been told to us in very clear terms that even in their focus countries, the donors don't have energy access specialists on their teams. So when they're working with the ministries as donors, they're also unaware of all this stuff that needs to change, or at least that they're still kind of pushing for the 20th century technologies that they do understand, rather than the 21st century technologies that are just coming out.
Right. So Fabiola, there's a good example in Brazil of a government sort of initiative to actually do something about this, isn't there?
Yeah, actually, yeah. At least I can say for Brazil, and they had quite an interesting experience back in 2003, in the beginning of the Lula administration. They launched literally, the translation is Light for All. It was the idea was to expand the electrification coverage throughout Brazil. We are 200 million people, and the electrification rate at that time was something around 70%. Mainly the rural areas were very poor connected, and the Amazon region. Remember that the Brazilian Amazon region occupies like 45% of the Brazil's territory, so it's quite vast, and there are a lot of people, not only indigenous, but a lot of people living there. Around 2 million people in the Brazilian Amazon. So with this Light for All, the investments were quite high in the Brazilian currency money, something around 22 billion reais, which nowadays would be like $7-8 billion, but at the time it was a different exchange rate. And nowadays electrification rate coverage is 98%, which is quite huge. And I think it was an interesting experience Brazil had at that time. And I just updated the information that before the impeachment of the former president Dilma Rousseff, she announced the Light for All national policy would be extended until 2018, with more than 200,000 people, mainly in rural areas. So it's quite an interesting approach, I guess, for public national public policy.
And it's good to see that kind of positive approach does work. I mean, it makes a change in individual lives.
Yeah.
Bill, I wanted to ask you about sort of the demand for energy and access to energy. I mean, are you finding with off-grid electric that people are kind of biting your hand off to get what you can offer them, or is there an issue of sort of energy education where you need to kind of make it clear what the benefits are of this kind of improved system?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's kind of the latter. Although it is a pretty clear and straightforward value proposition, we knock on doors, we get to know the homeowner, and we talk about how they're getting energy and how much they're paying for that energy. And if you're buying kerosene, you're charging your phone, you're probably paying $4 a month, $5 a month, and then to provide them with a solution that is $7 a month or $6 a month, and in 3 years they own it outright and have energy for free, and it's wildly superior to kerosene or whatever the alternative they're using. It is an education process. It is expensive. They understand that, but it's really compelling. So we find kind of conversion when we knock on doors and and introduce our company to be very high. So there is significant demand. The demand tends to be limited by pricing. Some people won't even burn kerosene, or $3 a month could be a big increase for them, and that's where we need things like VAT exemptions and import duty exemptions, and maybe even more importantly, we need cost of capital reduction. Here, it's probably the biggest cost structure in this industry, because we're financing our customers, right? They take out a loan, so to speak, to afford this. So that means that our companies have to finance it, and we're financing it with venture capital and high return on capital things. So there is an education process. There is a limitation, tends to be on from a pricing and a cost perspective, but those things they're going one way and they're getting better. They're not getting worse.
Right. I mean, it's a slow, steady process, isn't it? You can't rush this kind of thing. You can't just drop everything in. And one of the things I think that Practical Action's been involved in is quality standards as well have to be upheld. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And in there's two halves to this coin. So if something is of a high quality standard, you would expect that it would cost more. But of course, the reality is that if you have something that's low quality and it breaks down, and if you want to keep that same service, you have to then buy it a second time or pay for it to be repaired. One of the big challenges in this market is that on the microgrid side, which is the bigger scale of the off-grid side, there are no quality standards at the moment. But what we've seen in the solar home system and the solar lantern side of things, that an international quality standard has developed through the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association and the IFC's Lighting Global program, which has really, really encouragingly, and to the chagrin of many people in the sector who have paid for this quality certification, it has created really high quality black market knockoffs as well. So the cheap Chinese copies are now basically just as good as the products of people like D-Light or Mobisol and SolarAid, who have paid for and developed these quality certified products. So on the one hand, the certification is fundamentally important, but on the other hand, somebody has to pay for it. And in a really small niche industry, the forerunners who are paying for it are paving the way both for themselves and for people to follow. So, again, this sector is such a fundamentally important one, and it does need support. And so we need to continue to support companies that are trailblazers in this area. And on the microgrid side, we need to support the companies that are trying to do this on a grander scale, because microgrids are much more expensive and complicated than the small pico solar market, and therefore the risks are higher, and therefore the cost of capital is even higher for those guys than they are for the solar home system companies. But they do, at the end of the day, offer really high levels of power. You can run an arc welder, or power large scale community infrastructure with them, that at the moment solar home systems are they're focusing on a different customer base. But I imagine that's going to change as the technology continues to progress. But,
Right. So I mean, this is an extraordinarily complex area. There's no quick fix. We've got to really think carefully about this. I'm going to throw things over to audience questions in just a minute. I think we can squeeze in a couple of questions. But first, I'd just like to ask each of you for your kind of, your priority wish list, as it were, your number one wish that you think needs to happen in order to make energy access, make meeting SDG 7 really possible. So can I start with you, Fabiola? Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Under my perspective as a journalist, and from what I've seen, I think that building trust and engaging with the communities, not only indigenous, but with the communities, the people who are on the ground, engaging with them should be at least a priority, and not only a bureaucratic checklist. Because in Brazil, there's just one example for indigenous communities, the Convention 169 from ILO, which is the right to the free prior consent consultation. It is being put into practice, but sometimes in a bureaucratic way, sometimes not really engaging, just to tick and say, yes, we did it. So I think that building trust, that would be my suggestion for policymakers and companies as well.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you. Bill.
I'm going to cheat and say two things. One, I talked about cost. So there's three costs in our business. There's the product cost, there's the operating cost, and there's the cost of capital. Cost of capital that has to be passed on to this customer is prohibitive in many ways. It's at least prohibitive in it really materially expanding the market size. That'll get solved in my mind with local market lending. So once local banks decide to lend to this customer segment, which they traditionally have not lent to, we will have a depository cost of capital base, which is much lower than a venture capital cost of capital base. We'll also have innate hedging because they're lending in local currency, and these currencies have very significant hedging costs, which have to be passed on to customers. So that's one. But the problem with that is that doesn't happen unless we get the second thing that we need, and that's line of sight to profitable businesses. Once we get line of sight to profitable businesses, that this is where I've been in so many of these discussions where people talk about capital and they talk about regulatory and they talk about standards, which are all enablers and are required because this industry is still bridging to scale. The companies themselves have to be held accountable to building sustainable businesses. If you don't build sustainable businesses, this is never going to work. So we need both. We need to build sustainable businesses. If we do that, we'll bring capital in that is low cost, and we pass on to the customer and grow the market.
Thank you. Okay, Aaron.
So my answer is going to just build on these two. I want to stress again that the issue of education is fundamental here, and I don't mean school education in this context. So what Bill was just saying about the cost of capital. So I always say this fairly logical but sometimes controversial thing about the cost of capital. So capital and getting financing, be it in climate change issues in general or in energy access in particular, so financing is about risk. So that's all it is. It's about understanding risk and how much you're willing to pay for the higher or lower chance of something going bankrupt or exploding. And there's the natural risks where you've got your hurricanes and floods and everything. And then the other side is mostly about trust and understanding of the technologies, of the customers, of the business person who's engaging in this, of the service provider, of the intermediaries, etc. And the reason why there isn't much local lending in this space is because there's not a lot of understanding of the space amongst local banks. There's not a lot of trust in the bottom billion as viable customers. They're seen as beneficiaries still. And the sooner we can educate people about how amazing the repayment rates are in this sector, the sooner we can get that local capital in and we can really start to change everything, including the bottom-up planning process that I talked about before. As soon as people are trusted, everything kind of starts flowing much easier after that. And just the last closing point is that's why we also created this Power for All partnership, which I would invite you all to join. It is all about legitimizing the solar home system and microgrid sectors as really fundamental parts of 21st century energy planning. And it's about getting people to better understand it and also getting the arguments. We have fact sheets and infographics that are all open source for people to just use to show, the real numbers of how isn't 1988 anymore. This is 2016 and things are looking up, and they are looking up using different technologies. And we would all love it if you could help us share that message.
Thank you. Okay. I just want to give a couple of minutes for lightning quick. If there's a burning question or a couple of burning questions from the audience, does anybody have anything they would like to ask the panel? Yes, there's a microphone here. Is it okay for you to use that, just so we can all hear the question?
And please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name's Jessica. I wanted to ask, you all talked about the importance of engaging communities and building that trust and holding hands, and I 100% agree. But a lot of the organizations, whether they be governments, multilaterals, donor or local governments, they're responsible to the public to be seen to be really, really efficient. And if there's a project that's spending 20% on technical assistance or whatever amount, any increase in that is a risk that that whole budget line is going to be shut down because it's seen as inefficient by the local paper. How do you think we should deal with that? And are there any cases where you've seen this done well? You've seen it sold to taxpayers essentially?
I'm going to ask Bill if he can answer that succinctly. Is that possible?
No, I don't think I can answer.
Okay, Aaron, I'll give it to Aaron.
I mean, one thing that we're working on right now is exposing the other side of that question, which is, so in Tanzania, for instance, the Norwegian government subsidizes every single utility connection by $800 US. In Kenya, the cost of an electricity connection to the end user is over $1,000 US. That is still subsidized several hundred US dollars by other donors. And when we look at like a truly level playing field of the cost of these technologies to end users and to the public sector, the utility is the most expensive of all. And utilities in most sub-Saharan African countries and in a lot of South Asian countries are actually bankrupt at the moment. And it's something that if actually all the facts were on the table, we definitely would not have to worry about that kind of media response, because the fact is that they're actually better, these small scale projects.
Okay, thank you. One more very succinct burning question there in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, when you're working with local communities, for all three of you, how you consider the gendered aspects of energy use and need for energy access, and if you, especially when you're working with household levels and local communities, how you ensure that women are involved and women seen as customers and women's access to financing. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am going to give that to Bill.
Yeah, I'll take that. I can answer that one. We think about it both in terms of the impact on the home, and the connection point between this and health issues and women empowerment. Education in the home is profound. Most of our communities, the women isn't making the decision, but the women is massively influencing the decision. We look to engage with both when we sell. We, even more importantly, in my mind, we look to engage women empowerment in our workforce. So about 35% of our full-time employees in Tanzania and Rwanda are women. And if I can get that to 70, I would take it. No offense, men, but the women are more effective. Now there's security issues and some other things about going door to door and selling at night that we have to grapple with, and other kind of societal issues that we have to grapple with. But if we're not the number one, we're top 2 or 3 in terms of growth of women employment in Tanzania. It is hugely important for us, and a key business initiative within the company.
Thank you very much. Before we move to the second part of our presentation from the Rockies Institute, can you just please join me in thanking our panel?
Yeah, and I'm just going to put a bunch of publications out on the side somewhere, so if anyone wants to learn about what we're up to, yeah.
Thank you.
Including the Power for All partnership.
It's very hard to get Aaron off a microphone.
I'm literally paid to talk.
Yeah. So there is still beading going on. Has anybody not yet contributed a bead to the string who would like to? Please make yourself known, and we'll get that to you. I'd like to introduce you now to our partners here from the Rockies Institute. Standing here is Laura Lyons, who is the director of the Rockies Institute, who's going to speak briefly about their work and objectives. Sitting here is Kanzi Fox from the Kana First Nation. She's the Environmental Protection Manager for the Blood Tribe Land Management. And at the end is Greg Pedser, Founding Director of the International Center for Northern Governance and Development at the University of Saskatchewan. And he'll be talking to the climate partnership situation around the Canadian Arctic. So we're going to start off with a presentation from Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Michael. So if you didn't hear earlier, we're passing around beads to string, and we're going to send these back to the Kainai First Nation, and that's in southern Alberta, as a symbol of global cooperation and hope. Okay, so our panel is a little bit different. And sorry, I'm having technical problems with this. Is not working. Okay. All right. So I'm going to very, very quickly introduce our project that we're working on with the Blood Tribe, also the Kainai First Nation, as an example of non-Indigenous and Indigenous partnership building. The partnership goals are to build capacity to address climate change in the short, medium, and long term, increase overall knowledge about climate change within the tribe, and to help the tribe address the risks of an uncertain changing future. So some of the things we're working on is also sharing knowledge locally, but also globally. So locally, within the Blackfoot Confederation, which is the confederacy, which includes other tribes in Canada, Kanzi will explain more about that, but also transnational in the US. And internationally, we have a proposed comparison project with the Nama tribe in South Africa, who has enough points of comparison that we think this will be a really interesting way to bring Indigenous people together to talk about issues such as tourism, agriculture, extractive industries, and national parks, because they both deal with national park. And building a culture of trust in context. So context of Canada's history with Indigenous peoples, and in consideration of what sharing traditional knowledge means. So there's traditional knowledge that's private, it's sacred. And we need to be cognizant of this when we're starting to talk about how can traditional knowledge be invited into the conversation for public good or for global climate change cooperation. But there is also context to that historical context, and also the privacy of maybe what the tribe doesn't want to share. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can look it up yourselves, and many of you probably know it better than I do, but this project will also contribute to Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement under Article 6 and 7. So we have a duty to now engage in a different way with Aboriginal people, and to listen to traditional knowledge and to bring that knowledge into our solutions. So what does that mean? How do we do that? And I believe that this project is going to help address some of those questions. And now I'm very happy to pass it over to Kanzi.
Hello, Oki, Nadanako Abetsitipiaki. That's my Blackfoot name, and it means Weasel people woman. So I was born in southern Alberta in a tribe called the Blood Tribe, or Kainai, and it's a part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which Laura mentioned. The Confederacy includes different tribes, one in Montana in the US. They are the Southern Blackfeet, and the Piikani tribe, Siksika, and Blood are all in Canada. So together we constitute the Blackfoot Confederacy, and I believe there's a map on the next slide. So the Confederation of Canada is 150 years old, and the effects of colonization are still being felt. And what First Nations had gone through is the agreements called treaties, and specifically for the Blood Tribe, it was the Treaty 7. The understandings of these agreements were different from the First Nation and government signings at the time. And most First Nations feel that their rights aren't being upheld through these treaties. So most Indigenous people live on reserves in Canada, although a majority do live off as well. The Blood Tribe being the largest reserve in Canada, there's a population of approximately 12,000, I think 500. So with the ever increasing population, there's much more members moving off the reserve into surrounding communities and cities. And what we're doing with the Rockies Institute is trying to create this partnership that's built on trust, and that's going to involve the community. And that's going to take a lot of involving community in discussions about climate change and working towards building resiliency in climate change impacts. So that also means that our partners and people who don't understand our religion and our culture are going to have to look at our traditional ways and what people call traditional knowledge. So that's our way of living, our perspectives on how we look at life, and it all can be impacted by climate change. So yeah, that's a map of the traditional Blackfoot territory. As you can see, it spans from Alberta to Saskatchewan down to Montana and Wyoming. So the Confederacy is the oldest residence of the Western Prairie region of North America. We're traditionally a buffalo culture. We relied on the buffalo for everything, for our livelihoods. And when that was wiped out, we were put on the reserves and are facing the consequences of all that colonization. Let's see, we are currently, some impacts of climate change that we are seeing in our First Nation are increased severity and occurrence of weather events, extreme events like flooding, drought, and severe storms. Invasive species have come in, and a change in the wildlife movement. Vulnerabilities in energy are also present, but also opportunities. So some key points, like I was talking about, our traditional way of life involves the lands, the plants, and the animals, and the balance of that is felt when climate change impacts those areas. So those changes affect our cultural, economical, social, and environmental way of life. Blackfoot culture is based on a reciprocal relationship with the land and requires a responsibility on our part to make sustainable decisions and maintain a healthy relationship with Kainai people and the land. So like I was talking about the dialogue that needs to happen, it's going to have to include different groups of people, different knowledge holders, people coming from different perspectives, and all sorts of expertise. And that's where that trust comes in, the need to build that bridge in order to get on the same level and understand each other's perspectives. And that would help in creating effective solutions for adapting to climate change. Just wanted to share that quote there. One of our elders is helped in guiding a lot of our environmental management decisions on the reserve. And he's a well-known elder and doctor, is Leroy Littlebear. He shared with me this quote: "Culture is a mutual relationship with the land. If changes occur to the land due to climate change, then the culture is affected. Our cultural reference points are disappearing because of climate change." So that kind of gives you an idea of how closely we're tied to the land and feel the effects of climate change.
Good. Howdy, I'm Greg Peltzer. I'm from Saskatchewan, so right next door, a neighboring province to Kenzie and Laura. And what I've been working on, or we're looking at over the last few years, actually, about renewable energy in Indigenous northern and remote communities. And what this is going to impact in areas like Canada, United States, and other circumpolar countries. And one of the things when we're looking to this global shift that we've seen since 2015, hallmarked, of course, by the Paris Agreement, is a real strong uptick in terms of particularly the Arctic 8 states looking at developing more renewable energy resources. And the reality in places like Canada and Alaska, Russia, Greenland, is most of those renewable energy resources are going to go across Indigenous lands and Indigenous waters. And there's often, it's come up, it's actually quite welcoming to hear that there isn't an automatic assumption that green energy necessarily means good energy. And it really depends on how that is done. The second point I wanted to make in terms of context is that northern communities face both energy access and energy security challenges. And what was incredibly interesting about the panel just prior to us from our colleagues was many of the issues that were identified. You could have just substituted somewhere in Africa, you could have equally in Indonesia, and substituted the word Greenland or Alaska or Northwest Territories or Northern Saskatchewan, and you wouldn't have had to change anything else. So these are remote communities share some very common challenges. But there's also an unprecedented, I think, opportunity, particularly in Canada, where renewable energy, the investments that are going to be made in the energy transition shift is going to create a remarkable opportunity for renewing Indigenous relations in Canada through renewable energy. And where we've done some work in, because this is about partnerships, I want to talk a little bit about the work we did on the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. So it's part of one of the 17 scholars in the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, which was funded by the State Department of the United States under their chairmanship of Arctic Council. You know, it's on the energy group, and we had colleagues from Alaska, Iceland, Finland, Russia, Norway, and we were working together on looking at how do you address the barriers and opportunities to develop renewable energy in Arctic and subarctic areas. So that's, when you look at the map that's on there in Canada, the Arctic and subarctic areas are where it looks pink and that light purple to dark purple. So it's both the territorial north and the provincial north in Canada. I'll flip the next one. One of the things we pulled out from the University of Saskatchewan and University of Alaska Fairbanks is we cooperated on the development of an off-grid, pan-Arctic off-grid map to kind of give a sense of how many communities there actually are across the Arctic region that are islanded, that they aren't tied to any grids. And if you see some of the darker patches on there next to those grids, take away the bottom grays around the map, those are regional grids. And those aren't tied to national electric grids. So the challenges are huge. They're frankly enormous across the circumpolar north. The one exception area is Northern Scandinavia. And if you look on the map and see Northern Scandinavia, all communities on mainland, Norway, Finland, and Sweden are tied to the grid. But even in the case of Northern Norway, they have a weaker grid in northern Norway, and it's going to require enormous infrastructure development if they're going to add renewable energy projects in the Norwegian North of any significant scale. So what are some of those barriers? So that, I'll flip to the next slide. So leaving it 4 key points, there's the URL to the report that we produced, and we presented to the State Department and White House in the 3rd week of October, our colleagues. But there's 4 main areas I want to identify, and I'm going to focus on within them the recommendations that really talk about partnerships. And the first one, and it's a theme that's come up through the conference here at COP22 and is quite encouraging, is about the importance of engaging communities, both through assessment and consultation processes at the earliest stages of project and planning development. And to give one example, we could go across every Arctic state and find examples of how not to do things. But one of them, to take an example, is northern Sweden. Sweden is investing a lot in wind energy in terms of greenhouse gas reduction targets. But they've put 100 megawatt wind farms up in northern Sweden with very little consultation. And many of these wind farms are actually in the middle of reindeer calving areas, which of course for the indigenous Sami creates enormous problems because there's already intensive use in that area that's complicating life for reindeer herding. So here where you think you're doing something good by putting in green energy can create tremendous difficulties at the local level. The other area where partnerships are going to matter tremendously if we're going to make progress in the development of renewable energy is having a transparent information sharing system, both on energy costs and subsidies. And if you go across, that is one of the most difficult things to get information on. What are actually true costs? What are actually true subsidies? That's actually extremely difficult to get and to compare. And where that matters is in terms of making the value propositions around the development of renewable energy projects. The second big area about building local capacity or local level renewable development, several of the recommendations we looked at from our comparative context around the circumpolar north create opportunities for knowledge sharing, the development of core competencies in the renewable energy sector. One of the things that's actually launching this year is a program called ARENA. So it's the Arctic Remote Energy Network Academy. And that one will be pulling together resources. You can always do more collectively than you can individually. And when we're looking at smaller communities, how that's partnering up across from Alaska to Canada. Canada's, the Canadian government's invested in that program. So people at the local level in northern communities can get the technical training they need for the development and operation of renewable energy projects in their communities. Second area is facilitating, encouraging regional cooperation opportunities. One of the most interesting things, you look, it's a fairly infant sector within Canada, but it's interesting, you go to the state of Alaska and they have the highest penetration of renewable energy and microgrids anywhere in the world. And which comes as a surprise to many people because we often associate Alaska with oil production. But one of the things that's facilitated that success is the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative. So that's a cooperative that was founded 1969. It has over 56 communities. In terms of geographic distribution, it's the largest electric cooperative in the world. And many of the communities are only around 500 people. But it's a Native Alaskan run and operated electrical cooperative that's running very successfully. A third area in this local development in cooperation is among industries. And to give an example, in my home province of Saskatchewan, where I think the provincial government made a very wise and strategic decision in helping facilitate the potential for a biomass industry by giving forest license opportunities to First Nations forestry operators. So Meadow Lake Tribal Council in Northwest Saskatchewan has been operating over 30 years in the dimensional lumber industry and doing sustainable forestry practices. But the fact that they can control their own forest management and the feedstock, both for the dimensional lumber and the waste product that can go into biomass creates a sustainable, virtuous circle. And it's that kind of creative thinking and partnerships between First Nations industries, communities, and government that I think will prove very helpful into the future. Another area, two last recommendations I want to mention out of the Fulbright report is one is around equity ownership opportunities. And again, to give an example from my home province of Saskatchewan, there's a project in the works that's initiated by Black Lake First Nation at Tazi-Tway is the name of the hydro facility that's proposed to be developed. And that one will be roughly about a $500 million investment. It will be a 50 megawatt hydro facility, but it's going to be run a river. And on that one, the consultation, even though the community initiated and sought with the state-owned utility to develop the project, there's a heavy amount of consultation. And if you go to the website around that particular, you'll see a very unedited video about pros and cons. And they wanted to have a full vetting. It wasn't skewed one way or the other, which is quite remarkable for any kind of energy development project. And the community ended up voting in the majority to proceed with it. But there was involvement of elders and other community members in terms of how to protect, in terms of diversion barriers for water to go down the chute for the Runner River. But the beautiful thing too, it's not going to be dammed up. You're not going to have the flooding of the old traditional style hydro development facilities. In that project though, Black Lake First Nation is going to end up owning 30% of that hydro facility. So they're going to be an owner. So the revenues that are going to be generated over the life of the operations of that agreement are going to go to that First Nation. So they're an owner operator on a product that they initiated, create sustainable revenue streams. And if this project comes to fruition as we expect it to do, be a remarkable story of partnership and how to succeed in building renewable energy. The last one is, for at least a circumpolar north, I think creates a great opportunity. And again, I draw the parallels that we had with the panel earlier in similarities north and south. And this is an area where in the Arctic region, tremendous amount of experience in Alaska, growing experience in places like Canada and certainly Iceland, that if communities at the level, Indigenous communities, Northern communities are able to cooperate together, you can create an economy of scope, which is able to create a community-driven global export market. And we're looking at right now currently about 1 billion people who do not have electricity, about that many more that are either on islanded microgrids or weak ties. So that kind of cooperation is really potentially the wave of the future that can be powerful and transformative in a time when the globe is going through some massive energy transitions. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thanks very much. Yeah, let's thank the panel.
Oh, I want to just make a shout out. Actually, our Minister of Environment is here, Minister Mo from Saskatchewan.
Thank you for attending.
Yeah.
Let me, I want to open the floor to audience questions. But let me start with self-indulgence, which is, I'm going to ask you a question first. We talked about, you talked about the importance of networks, and we found in our WGSI research that actually networking Indigenous communities together and across the world as well. So not just within nations, but actually, as you mentioned, north and south, we seem to be in a position where we could really launch something quite powerful. Do you see these networks as being something that could sort of change the game for these communities, which have been basically sort of, there's an asymmetry, isn't there? And we need to restore that asymmetry. And is networking the way forward for that?
I'll respond.
Yeah.
I just have a short thing to say about that. I believe that the networking and the bringing together global North and South Indigenous communities could actually be one of the platforms for the Indigenous Peoples platform. They're talking about having an online platform. That's nice, but there's a lot of Indigenous people who don't have access to online and don't communicate that way. So I'm interested in maybe this being a model at the international level too.
Great.
Fundamentally agree, and even on a small scale, I'll give a concrete example where these networks matter. One is the arena that I mentioned before in terms of training, but another one between a Saskatchewan-Alaska connection. One of the challenges we have in the north is around energy efficient homes that are also healthy homes, don't have black mold and so on. Because of the visits between Saskatchewan and Alaska and sharing information at the community level, we're able to take research from the Cloak Climate and Housing Research Center and building a couple of prototypes on housing that would be for less cost than currently the federal government spends and deals with the health issues and would be far more energy efficient. So you see those kind of things spreading. But networks, I think you nailed it. They're fundamentally powerful. They lower transaction costs. They build capacity.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Do we have questions from the audience? The lady here. If you could use the microphone and introduce yourself as well, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Christine Kaya. I come from Uganda. I coordinate the Parliamentary Forum on Climate Change. And if I'm not mistaken, Africa may be having the largest number of indigenous communities. What I've observed in the communities of the indigenous communities is that we are trying to extend the renewable energy technologies, but the storage is an issue because appropriate conditions to generate power are too seasonal. But after the seasons are off, no storage, and we are going back to zero. Especially when you want to connect the mini grids, that is an issue. And then the other one is the wild game, the movement of wild game. However much we do what, the indigenous people are on the run because they cannot cope up with the animals. They are competing for resources. You find wild game using the same water sources with the communities, and it is a serious challenge. So I am looking out for ways of how those communities can actually live in harmony with the wild game without the wild game eating them. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can. Sure, I'll take a first shot at it. Yes, totally agree, and you hit a couple of things right on the head, because in the Arctic area as well, the storage issue is really important, and it's important for a couple of reasons. One is the seasonality, and also, frankly, up and downs of wind. You don't have constant wind every day, for example, in wind production. Similar for solar production. But on microgrids, they create huge variability, especially if you have any kind of fossil fuel backup, diesel or whatever. And those are creating huge challenges. So there's a variety of technologies folks are implementing or trying. One is in like flywheel technology, obviously battery technology, but also dumping it as heat, and which is a little longer. I don't know if that would deal with the seasonality, which is a much longer period of time, but I think that you've hit a very, very important point. The storage issue is almost as important as the technology we're developing to generate the power. Your second point around making sure it's harmonious in terms, especially folks living off the land, is vitally, vitally, vitally important, and it's hard to overstate. And that's where I think the days of the large storage dam hydro facilities should be done in the long term. I think we should be looking where possible for run-of-river solutions, for example, because it's far less disruptive to things like fisheries, far less disruptive to even ungulates or large animals, game animals, because you don't change the riparian environment. So fully agree. But what you just said now, we could have exactly that conversation in Northern Canada. Much appreciated.
I can kind of speak to the competing for resources and the wild game issue. So we do some monitoring, and we collaborated with the province of Alberta on monitoring grizzly bears in our timber limit, which is our forested area on the reserve. And what we did was kind of monitored their movements across the land and got a good idea of where their patterns of movement were, so we could coexist with them instead of trying to, the old way of just taking them out of the solution, which isn't a solution. So that's kind of our traditional way of doing things, is we coexist and live with the animals instead of trying to manage them.
Okay. We've got 2 questions at the back.
Ron Russo, I'm the Aboriginal Vice President of the Canada Labour Congress. I live inside of one of your remote communities. I live in Carcross in the Yukon, and my community actually has a transmission wire, but I also have a generator that is needed to make sure that my freezers don't cut out my fridge, just because of how unreliable it is. When we look at the northern communities, when we start looking at solar, well, I'm not too bad. I get about 4 hours, but when you go further north, it gets much worse. But I think that one of my main concerns is keeping it either public or state First Nation owned, because we've seen what happened inside of Ontario when it did go to private. Is we saw the price of power go through the roof, and it's not controlled by the people. So when it's controlled by the people, whether it be state or government owned, or it's owned by the First Nation, is that they can control. It's not about profit. It's about providing a service. And I think that's of utmost importance when we start looking at going north and how far this goes, because it's not going to be one large company going across all the north, or it very well could be, and they could just sit down and look after profits. But I do think that it needs to be public or First Nation mandated, and going forward that they have some control of where it ends up, because we see too many things going just for profit.
This is an interesting issue, isn't it? Because actually, when you consider what you get from electricity access in terms of healthcare and well-being and education, housing opportunities, economic development, it's very easy to see it really as a public good, that it's fundamentally almost a human right, and governments should be doing more to make sure it's not just a source of profit for somebody.
And that really comes up, this is a very good point, because especially around transmission and distribution, even more so than the power generation itself, because you'll have places like in Alaska where there's actually a wind farm just off of Anchorage, but they wanted to sell it to Fairbanks, but there's a number of owners along the transition, and everyone wanted a tariff along the way, and that made it prohibitively expensive and couldn't do it. But there's another point I wanted to follow up on, is tying into the transmission lines themselves. And about, just because you have transmission line connection doesn't mean you have reliable power. And especially in the winter in the north, that's a lifeline. And I'll take my home province, Saskatchewan. There's a southern grid, northern grid. Northern grid's 800 kilometers on Precambrian shield, so it's not grounded. The communities are tied to it along the 800 kilometers. If there's a lightning strike or an electrical storm, power is down for everybody across all 800. So you can't disconnect from the grid, and that's where microgrids could actually, the local solution could provide greater energy security.
Do either of you want to speak into that? No. Okay, thank you. Yeah, very quickly. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I'm through a electrical grid, whether it be a fire, whether it be something along the line, as we get shut down for many hours, and the generator is absolutely imperative. But as we heard earlier, these microsystems that can be managed locally and taken care of, because when you start running wire and poles and wires, is you end up with a system that can have problems, but it also uses a lot of power to run them. So, getting down to the local base really takes a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. A question here. Thank you.
My name is Lydia Mohano, and I come from South Africa. I have a question. Let me first start by saying that I believe that indigenous communities and even other local communities have useful and rich knowledge and cultures that I believe the rest of the world need to draw from in terms of preserving the environment generally. So sometimes indigenous communities are seen as communities in the periphery. So I believe, until we begin to embrace them as part of the part, as part of the, let me just say, of a society, as opposed to being left outside.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I think the first two speakers raised something around, challenges with the buffaloes going extinct, if I'm not mistaken. So I see that there is an issue with preserving both biological and cultural diversity. And I think that contributes towards promoting climate resilience in communities. So now my question is, in most conservation measures, it becomes difficult to preserve values, most importantly, the intangible ones. It's easy to calculate livelihoods in economic, value systems. But then there are this other spiritual and cultural stuff and that contribute to well-being that are often intangible and difficult to measure and even communicate. So have you been able, or what measures have you put in place to somehow reconcile both the tangible and intangible values, so that I believe we can learn from that, and hopefully South Africa can learn as well.
Thank you. Great question.
So you've touched on a passion of mine. Right now, in international law and many of the domestic laws, you don't see the so intangible, or let's just say other species rights accounted for very much. So there's some mechanisms, but I can't say that I've found a good example yet. I'm hoping that changes soon. However, the addition of traditional knowledge being written into the Paris Agreement, I think could be a trigger for exactly what you're talking about, because of the way that indigenous communities, I can't speak obviously for all of them, but the ones that I'm aware of, view species, life, and energy. And how to account for them, this is a big question, right? How do we put value to that? But I do believe that that conversation is going to have, it will be brought to the table more through indigenous knowledge coming to the table. Because it's a different worldview, it's a different way of looking at what is value. Is it just a commodity? Is it just for people? Is it anthropocentric? Or is it is biodiversity just for people? Or is it for others? So if anybody has an example, I would love to hear it. I don't have one, but I do believe we're going to see some.
Well, that's kind of what I was referring to by Blackfoot perspective. And it's something that you can't really understand unless you participate in that relationship. So like the Rockies Institute, Laura has come down and gotten to know a lot of our members in the tribe. And I think if she wants to understand more, she's going to have to participate in a lot of other cultural things that not only you can see, but you can feel and know for yourself what that means. So with the traditional knowledge, that has to be defined by the communities themselves. It's going to be different for each First Nation. It's not a general thing that can be put out there. So.
Thank you. I'd like to squeeze in one more question, which is going to come from the gentleman at the back there.
Thank you. I represent Canadian Union of Postal Workers, about 50,000 members from coast to coast. Incidentally, we were in Edmonton a while back, and we were asking, we met some Aboriginal hiring agencies, their name, not ours, but, and we asked the specific question is, because we're trying to create jobs and in the post for allow access for First Nations communities, which have always been shut out. And so we asked this question about, incidentally, are there new climate jobs in Alberta with a downturn in the oil industry and all that stuff? Has there been any consideration of transitioning any of that stuff? and they didn't know anything about it. And it was really kind of tragic because we knew that there was stuff going on in some of those communities, and we were like amazed by it. And so I guess my question is so we've got our own vision plan about greening, because we think we all have to take a step up, and no matter what we do. And so we're looking at sort of retrofitting some post offices, some of our union offices as well, because we think that we don't want to speak out of both sides of our mouth. We want to do it in our own organization and be an example and promote it with others. And to start, maybe identifying some locations where we could sort of push that project. And I'm just wondering if you've had any experience in terms of the public sector or working, in that vein of with a large national infrastructure, where you're going and doing trying to do some model projects, and how that might work, and how, if you've got any advice or recommendations for us as we proceed down that path. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I'll say two things.
Okay.
And then I'll hand it
Yeah,
to you.
you bet.
Show up and listen.
Yeah. No, you raise a really good point. In a lot of it's around capacity. And I know one of the things, taking an example around this capacity about knowing what programs are available and how do you be able to access and engage in that development. So one of the things that the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations and the government of Saskatchewan did a few years ago is create a non-governmental organization called First Nations Power Authority. And what it did, its mandate is basically to assist First Nations communities that are interested in renewable energy, either at the local utility level or potentially as independent power producers. But both in the vetting process, getting information out, because doing this kind of stuff is not simple. It's not just like buying a hotel operation or a gas station operating that kind of business. Fundamentally a different kettle of fish. So that's one example of addressing an issue I think you've hit on the head, which is going to be critically important moving forward.
Thanks, Greg. That's all we have time for. Please join me in thanking the panel from the Rockies Institute. Thank you so much for your attention. Please make sure you collect WGSI's COP22 brief on Indigenous energy issues. It includes recommendations for global action on energy access and is grounded in examples from communities in Canada. We welcome feedback on the session on Twitter at WGSI Summit, or send an email to info@wgsi.org. And finally, we invite you all to join us for an off-site reception at La Mumunia, where we'll celebrate the launch of our partner Discourse Media's second Access to Energy Journalism Fellowship. That begins at 5 p.m. and further details, including a map and dress code, can be found at wgsi.org/COP22. Thanks very much for your attention. Thank you. I think it's okay.